Douglas, very nice to see you again, and thanks for joining AverPoint. We're really excited about your new paper and excited you're talking to us.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. I'm really happy to share what we've been learning recently.
Yeah, so this is for everyone on the AverPoint audience. Douglas teaches at the Haas Business School at UC Berkeley. And Doug, do you want to tell us about your work there?
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor in the management of organizations group. I specialize broadly in computational social science. And what I focus on primarily is online experiments looking at how the structure of a social network or the structure of an online environment shapes what kinds of information spread, how it spreads. And so this directly relates to topics that I know AverPoint is doing great work to explore, such as disinformation, how do erroneous beliefs arise, how do alternative perceptions and perspectives arise, and how do those flow through a social system based on how people talk, who they talk to, so on and so forth.
And there's two terms in your state of art that I think the audience would love to hear your definition on. So one is collective intelligence. Can you just kind of help our audience kind of put a definition to that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that is distinctly human, or at least particularly pronounced in humans, is our ability to share our beliefs and perspectives by communicating. We learn from each other. We have our entire upbringing as a human being is mediated by all these social experiences where we're being taught things, we're observing others' behaviors, their norms, their beliefs, being influenced by them. Collective intelligence is, in general, the study of how those social learning processes, the exchange of information, exposure to behavior from one another, how that influences our beliefs. And so sometimes these processes can drastically improve our perspectives by giving us information we didn't have, exposing errors in our previous beliefs. Sometimes it can lead us astray through processes of groupthink, where a group ends up uh, believing that it has a very well supported view, but that's primarily because everyone shares a similar perspective. So they're reinforcing each other. They're not exposed to enough information from outside alternative perspectives. And so collective intelligence is the general investigation of those kinds of dynamics with an eye to discovering what kinds of environments are best for promoting reliable judgments and beliefs.
Yeah. So smart collective intelligence instead of a mob riot.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of your mission. And the other term I've seen in your papers is structured online network.
Yes.
So could you define that?
Yeah, so very shortly, in our experiments, a structured online network is basically a pattern of communication among people. So who gets to talk to whom that we impose among people in the network. So when you come to our platform to participate in our experiment, we just plop you somewhere in the network. And so throughout the entire experiment, you're only going to get to talk to these four people. However, those other four people might have connections you don't, and so on and so forth. So you get a larger network structure. And what that means is you can track how information from different points in the network is spreading so that you might actually be getting insights or judgments from someone else you have never actually talked to directly. It just flowed through the network. Now, the reason why we call them a structured social network is because as experimentalists, we benefit a lot from being able to directly measure the network structure. When we look at environments like Twitter, other popular social media platforms, there are many ways of chopping up the network data, many ways of building networks. And you can get a lot of purchase by using that data, but sometimes there's noise and estimation error in terms of how whether or not you've actually represented that network appropriately. So for our end, experimentally, we like to deal in cases where we don't have that measurement error for the network, but that's for the purposes of then supporting really good theory and science when looking at these noisier, more complicated environments.
Okay. So for the audience, is it fair to say an unstructured social network would be like the Wild West, and a structured social network might be a well-planned city?
So the short answer is yes, we can think about networks as being more or less structured in terms of, uh, and sometimes how intact the connections are between people. But what you're bringing up is a different notion of structured, which is in some ways an instability in network structure. So people connections are changing all very regularly, like you said, the Wild West, where it can be debatable whether or not a given social network remains stable during a period of time. Uh, that might indeed change the dynamics. Now, in general, when we look at social networks, we see a good amount of stability over time. But one of the things that environments like Twitter and other platforms bring on is the ability for automated accounts like bots and fake accounts that are tasked with spreading disinformation or tasked with spreading politically inflammatory views. They are sort of very rapidly entering social network structures. So you can get some of these more
Okay.
unstructured or very recently structured.
Okay. My analogy then is off. Maybe it's more like a crime-ridden city versus a well-planned community in the suburbs or something like that. But let's put my analogies to the side. So I'm super excited to talk about your new paper. Do you want to introduce that to the audience and what you found in probabilistic learning?
Yes, absolutely. So it was an implied extension of a body of work that's been growing for some time on collective intelligence and social learning, which has been focusing specifically on the study of how when people share their judgments, like predictions in uncertain environments, how they can learn from each other. So prior work in the quote unquote wisdom of the crowds argued that if people communicated and shared their views, it would lead to their errors becoming correlated so that they would end up becoming biased in very similar ways. And that would actually disrupt the value of their group intelligence. It would lead to inaccuracies. But some work done by my advisor and colleagues in 2017 showed that actually, if you let people communicate numeric estimates, say like you're trying to predict how many people are in a crowd, how many jelly beans are in a jar, how many calories are in this meal, it turns out if you let people exchange their judgments in networks, you can get really reliable learning processes where both individual judgment and the group's judgment as a whole becomes more accurate. And so I started thinking about whether that system could help the detection of disinformation online, because a part of what was very empowering about that finding is, in a way, it created a situation where even novices or people who, I mean, there's no one that has any particular, in the experimental trials, from what we know, had any particular expertise in like counting the number of heads in a crowd, right? So these are people that are just normal folks dealing with a potentially challenging problem, and you could systematically improve their judgment. So in an environment, a problem space like disinformation, where the challenge is how does a common everyday user of the internet distinguish between useful, truthful content and potentially deceitful or at least errorful content? How do they make that distinction? I was like, gee, it would be really nice if you could improve that. And so the thought was, could you actually look at how communication patterns improve that communication among your friends or family or peers online? Now, the key challenge is when you actually look at the literature about how communication should affect that process of misinformation and disinformation detection, it had similar themes to the early wisdom of the crowd's literature, in that it was like so much work was looking at how disinformation spreads online, how people are following clickbaity uh, titles and then sharing it with their friends, and you get to the major science paper, the false news spreads further and faster online. And so there was this concern about communication networks actually being a vector, a channel for amplifying the effects of disinformation. And so I started scratching my head, how do these two perspectives line up? One suggests that talking to each other actually improves your judgments of disinformation. The other one suggests that it's likely disinformation can really spread in those kinds of contexts. And then I wondered whether it had to do in a way with how people were communicating about the disinformation. And for some time, I had been kind of frustrated with this whole conversation and research endeavor to study quote unquote fake news. And the reason why it was because, well, how do we know for sure content is fake, right? And I was thinking about if you have an article, right, that makes 20 different claims, if 10 of them are fake and 10 of them are true, is the article itself fake? And it seemed that this binary distinction between simply true or false or true or fake was rather limiting, but yet it was widely used, and by fact-checking agencies, by researchers in the space, and by politicians, right? Especially during the Trump administration, he had a whole campaign built on fake news, and what you could see was you could readily see that people's judgments of how to use this simple category fake drastically differed. Where, the right wing were claiming that the left wing sources were fake. The left wing was claiming that the right wing sources were fake. And
Right.
the whole conversation seemed to be overly simplistic. And so I looked into the literature on how these simple binary signals spread. Like if I were to just tell you true or false, it turns out that it's much more easy for prior research for false signals, like when you make a binary judgment, but your judgment is wrong, it's easier for that judgment to spread if it's a simple binary signal. Because I don't have any sense of your uncertainty, I don't have any sense of um, the strength behind your opinion there. I just get false or true. And then the reasoning was if I start seeing that, a good amount of people in my social network are simply saying false or simply saying true, then that becomes very compelling to an individual potentially. However, if you have them, provide a more weighted judgment, where now instead of just fake or true, they can actually get a judgment of, in some way, their confidence. So if you see something that seems to have, a couple true claims, a couple false claims, then someone might give a binary judgment like false, but if you ask them like, what is the likelihood that you think this is true or false, you'd actually see that there was some uncertainty there because they're picking up on the fact that there's a little bit of both, right? So they might say, it's actually a 60% chance that it's false, which all of a sudden that means a lot. That's very different from someone saying 99% chance that it's false. Because now that 60% gives you reason to start thinking more. Okay, well, why is there some uncertainty there? Why should I actually be, or am I missing on particular features that I should be considering? And the social learning literature that I had drawn from used a lot of judgments of that kind, where they're sharing more probabilistic numerical judgments, where people were actually able to reveal some of their uncertainty when they were
Mhm.
communicating. Um, and so the thought was, what if you created an experiment where the news content online is the same? Some of it's true, some of it's false, based on like what we know about the articles. And then you have people communicate in networks to classify the content and try to identify disinformation. But in one group, they can only use the binary classification. They can only say whether it's true or fake. The other group gets to express their uncertainty by saying, what is the likelihood that it's true? And the prediction was you would actually see greater improvements in the collective judgment, better environment for collective intelligence in the case where they could use the probabilistic judgment. And that's exactly what we found.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, can you just walk us through the mechanics of the experiment? The how many subjects, what you actually gave them to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were over 900 subjects. The way it worked is we recruited them from online, like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which, as you may be familiar, these crowdsourcing platforms are often used in content classification. People on these platforms are the ones who are tagging the images that are training the machine learning algorithms, or they're doing temporary jobs in content moderation for social media content. And so
Yes,
in
I had
some
a very
ways it's
early
a
one of my very early jobs involved tagging photos all day. It was not fun.
yeah, exactly. But well, unfortunately it's often quite thankless work, though they do get paid. There's good reason to pay them quite handsomely given the importance of the task, because
Of
it
course.
plays a pivotal role in the information ecosystem online. So We recruited people from this platform, and basically they consent to participate. And when they come to the platform, they're randomized. They don't know about the experimental machinery behind the scenes. They're randomized to be either in the probabilistic condition or the binary condition. And depending on what condition you're in, it changes how you can communicate with the other people in the group. So, what they would experience is they would see, in a given version of the game, they would see actual news content. And then they would say, okay, first you get a chance to provide your own opinion before you interact with anybody else. So if you're in the probabilistic condition, you get to say, what is the likelihood you think this is true? You get to type in whatever you think looking at the content. And you can see from our paper, we had content from all over different topics. We had politics, health, we had economics, all different domains. And so you get to see something like, one of them has to do with whether vaccines cause some sort of, mental issue, physical issue, and you get to put in your estimate. And then after you put in your estimate, you then go into the next round where now you get to see the aggregated group judgment because each person was put into a separate network of 20 people. So if I'm in the probabilistic condition, I'm going to go and it's going to say, okay, the average person in your group predicted, this actually is a 40% chance of being inaccurate. And then you get a chance to update your belief. You get to input your answer again. You go back into the round and you do it again. You get to see the judgment, you get to put in your answer, and then the task was over, and people would get rewarded based on their accuracy afterwards. And they did this for each group did 4 different items of news online, and we had across different groups, you would randomize the order so we know that the effects aren't due to the order of the content. Now, if you're in the binary condition, everything's exactly the same, except when you go to that stage where you're putting in your vote, you just get to say whether or not you think that the content is true, yes or no. And then when you see the group signal, you just get the fraction of people who thought it was true. And so that's the kind of coarse-grained information that people often have access to when we're relying on binarization, a binary model of proofs when organizing content. So that was the experimental design, and then we could study directly how the condition affected their baseline, like the accuracy of individuals, and then how the communication actually shaped their accuracy over time. And one of the nice things is we actually have really rich demographic data on everyone who participated. So we know their partisanship, their gender, their ethnicity, all self-identified. And so we could also look at partisan differences, the likelihood that both Democrats and Republicans provided the correct answer, and then how the different conditions affected that. And one of the results I'd be happy to talk in greater detail with you about is we looked at polarization, so differences in how Democrats and Republicans
Yeah,
judge the
would
content.
love to get into the results. I've got the graphics up that show kind of summarize it. Yeah, you want to walk us through the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So well, the first figure, right? Right. So if we look at the top left panel here, this was a direct test of just in some sense the fact that the way in which the communication signals were structured really mattered because we asked what was the ability for people to signal improvements in their judgments. And so this is the reason why we did this, right? Let's say that you uh, provide the incorrect answer and you're in the binary condition. Let's say the content is true and you voted false. Well, if you then see that the group judgment that is that 60% of your network voted true, so now the majority actually is thinking differently than you, perhaps you think to yourself, that it kind of makes me question, but 60% isn't really enough. 40% still think it's false, so maybe you actually are willing to stick to your guns. But what's happening internally is you're actually changing your confidence. You're like, well, maybe 60% is thinking this for a reason, but nah, for now, I'm going to stick with my viewpoint. The point is you in the binary condition, you are unable to signal that kind of updating in your head. You're not able to tell the other people in your network that you might actually be slightly weakening your position or changing your views. Whereas in the probabilistic condition, it's much easier to do that, right? Because if you initially vote, 40% likelihood, but you see that the group estimate is 60%, you can change from 40 to 45. And even if that's a minor change, what you're signaling to your network is that you're actually learning from the judgments that you're being
Right.
shown. And if every individual is doing that, or to some extent, at some probability, individuals in the network are doing that, you can actually get large scale shifts where the network will as a whole update much more robustly. And so it's just a direct indication. What it's looking at is the percent of individuals who are able to signal updating, who are actually signaling belief change in their network. So it's just to show that the straightforward finding that we predicted, which is that in the binary condition, it was much harder to signal that change. So far fewer individuals are doing that than in the probabilistic condition. So what that means is
And
there's a lot
it's
more.
staggering. The difference is staggering, and across all parties, there's a big change in willingness to move in the right direction. If you have so just to summarize for the audience, the probabilistic group is saying on a scale of 1 to 10, how true is this? And the binary group is saying, is it true or false? If you have the ability to show degrees of truth, you're much more willing to move in the right direction.
That's right.
And
That's right. Now it's the scale was 1 to 100, but it's exactly the same point that you're making. And the key thing there is what you're essentially asking is how much information is available to the group about what each other is thinking, right? And so what's happening in the probabilistic condition is people are able to show their thinking process, even if it's changing 1 or 2% up, 1 or 2% down, you're still showing some kind of process and how you're responding to the social signal. The
mhm,
ability to show that change just by voting true or false is much harder, much harder. So in a sense, there's much less information available to the social system when you're using that kind of labeling system.
right, and you're much more identifying your answer with your tribal affiliation, which you don't want to give up. But if you have degrees, you can move without feeling like you're just being disloyal to your party.
Exactly. And so one of the things that can be happening there that's of concern is if you're in the binary condition, you might have the scenario where people think that everyone is holding their beliefs just as strongly because they're keeping the same binary judgment. But under the hood, there's this untapped resource, which is the fact that people are increasing in their uncertainty, or they're increasing in their willingness to change their viewpoint. So the
Right.
point is it would be really nice if that was actually available. People actually had a sense of that because that might actually incentivize them to change their beliefs. To
Right.
know that people on their side are actually a bit more uncertain than they expected.
Right. Right. And then, so we're seeing that big difference across political parties. And then what does this graph mean, where it's in fraction of groups revising in the correct direction?
Yeah, so now what this is because for each group we can take the collective judgment, the aggregate, right? So in the binary, that's the majority vote. In the probabilistic condition, it's the average group estimate. So panel B really follows directly from panel A. If fewer individuals are changing their beliefs, then overall fewer groups will be changing their beliefs in the right direction. And so what is saying that not only at the individual level, but at the group level, we see much more reliable changes in the right direction, signaling a kind of social learning process if you're in the probabilistic condition than in the binary.
Yeah. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I wanted to then maybe try to apply this a little bit to the AverPoint review system. Um,
Yes.
so we currently ask a binary question. When someone gets to a claim, we ask the question: is there sufficient evidence?
Mhm.
And the reviewer says yes or no, and then they have to justify their answer and provide evidence.
Mhm.
Now, this is a little. We think this is a little more clever than saying true false, because we're kind of forcing people to engage at the level of evidence, which we've seen at least brings them a little closer to some common base of facts than if it's just true false, because we've seen the same behavior. True false just falls on party lines on any question that's been politicized.
Yeah.
But how might we, let's say we updated our review system with some of the learnings you found. What would you suggest we test?
Yeah, so one of the things I like about your current approach is, in a way, you're kind of indirectly making use of probabilistic judgments, and here's how. You have a judgment about sufficient, which is binary, but then when you're providing justifications, my guess is people are signaling in some sense their degree of confidence, right? Which is to say, if I say, yes, there's sufficient evidence, and then I just produce this deluge where I just bombard you with fact after fact after fact, it's kind of like, yeah, if you ask this person what is the probability that there's sufficient evidence, they'd say 100%. But you can imagine someone saying, yes, there's sufficient evidence, but then in their justification, they point out that certain things are inconclusive, right? In which case, they're saying, I'm going to err on the side of saying if they're sufficient, but I recognize that there's room for debate. And so what you're getting is a kind of a linguistic signal of what we're doing in our experiment, which is the probabilistic. Now, what I would recommend is, perhaps if it's a small change, to, in addition, just make a small probabilistic scale, which is to say, indicate your confidence. You have people do that, all the things you said, and said, in addition, 0 to 100%, how confident are you in your judgments here? And that provides useful information, because what you're getting is insight into someone's internal process. And then what you would like to see over time is that as your reviewers are sharing their viewpoints and engaging with the content, you'd want to see confidence increasing over time, ideally along with the quality of the judgments. And if you have both of those happening, that's a good indication that you're facilitating a robust review process.
I like that a lot. Yeah, and we can definitely test that approach. The other thing I'll mention on this before we jump to the second paper is we've seen a behavior that relates a lot to collective intelligence, which is when somebody arrives at a claim and they've seen other people have questioned it or reviewed it, they're much more likely to be, the second, the third, the fourth questioner or reviewer, rather than be the fresh start. There's something very daunting about putting the first pen to paper, but when you have some notion that other people have engaged, even if you don't know what the review is, just the fact that other people are questioning it or scrutinizing it almost gives you a permission to think about it in either direction. Whereas when it's all zeros, it feels almost too pristine. It's like, writer's block or a blank canvas. You don't want to touch it.
Yeah, no, I think that's an astute insight, because there are a couple ways to interpret it that are directly related to collective intelligence, and in fact directly related to our paper. So some of the studies which showed issues with binary signaling, they focused directly on these cases where someone starts off the process. And so if you have someone start off the process in a binary judgment, but it just so happens that they put in the wrong vote, then when that second person comes in, as far as I can tell, 100% of the population, at least the population they're exposed to for that evaluation, says the wrong answer, but they don't know it's wrong. And so if they happen to adopt it, then you get this sort of momentum effect where the first 3, 4 people, now they are disproportionately likely to be biased by that first person. And so it turns out that if you have these sequential processes where 1 or 2 people really get to start it off, then the binary judgments can actually quite often lead to error. Now, to your point about people being less willing to jump in, if my read there would be, people are somewhat tuned to using social information. And so they're going to dive in once they get a sense of what other people think, so that they can make sure that they're fitting in with what people are deeming to be reasonable. They have a clear anchor point, so that they can situate their viewpoint and they don't have to be the lone person who's gonna, battle with the rest of them and stick their neck out. And one of the things I would be concerned about, and it'd be worthwhile thinking about collective intelligence interventions, is among those people who happen to be the first, what might make them different? Are they the people who are perhaps more stubborn? Are they the people who are perhaps more willing to uh, state an opinion on the basis of limited social information, which can
Right.
lead them astray? And so
Yeah,
you can,
so I'll tell you right now what we see, and we should test this more rigorously. Um, so what we want is we want the first person to be somewhat knowledgeable on the topic. Like we want the threshold of leaving a review to be, this is a topic I know a lot about. Like a doctor should feel very low friction to review a medical claim, but should feel some friction to review a claim about like financial markets. Um, and without banning non-experts, we want to kind of direct that type of behavior. In reality, what's happening is there's a persona. It's the person who wants to throw tomatoes at the king, the kid who calls out the emperor with no clothes. Like there's just someone who's tuned to kind of have that I like to challenge, versus in some ways the first mover is the author of the article, the editor who blessed the New York Times article. And so the herd behavior is to just accept it. And then there's this iconoclast who throws a tomato, then more people come in. So it's fascinating. And there's all kinds of collective intelligence, but then just more like user psychology things that we need to like get right to get a good first mover review.
yeah, I mean, that's fascinating because it really illustrates how your platform is recreating and rediscovering some of the fundamental puzzles in collective intelligence. Because in prior work, we've looked at the effects of what's called network centralization. One simpler way to put that is when one person gets to be louder than others, one person gets to have more connections than others, or their opinion gets seen more than the opinions of others. One way that centralization could emerge in your platform is that first person. Because when they happen to be the only comment there, then anyone who comes afterwards gets to see them. Whereas if you're the 10th, 11th, 12th comment in like a thread of 20 comments, then now the probability of someone seeing your content is lower because it's only among those who are actually scrolling through everything, and you might actually get missed in the overall evaluation. What we have found in the study of centralization is that if the centralized individual is highly accurate, so this is what you would hope in like a hierarchical medical organization where the person at the top is indeed the most reliable source of medical information, then the collective intelligence process actually benefits because that centralized person much more rapidly spreads the good judgments, everyone learns from it, and you get group convergence more quickly. However, if the central person is wrong, then you have a much more rapid spread of disinformation. So in a way, the system is much more vulnerable or sensitive to its initial conditions. And a key insight that we've been developing is that uh, it really matters exactly to the intuition you captured about keeping your experts domain specific in the sense that what can happen is oftentimes when someone reaches a central position in an organization, or perhaps they get some sort of public popularity or fame, then even though they may have achieved their status by being a really good doctor in this specific domain or being an excellent engineer, now they have a platform to pontificate on other topics where people assume that they're going to be particularly smart, but they might not have the prerequisite knowledge to actually be the appropriate centralized voice on that topic. So if you can make sure that if you have a centralized system, if those first people are indeed the more accurate people on the topic, then I actually think you could provide a very good way of accelerating collective intelligence and boosting the quality of your review system. But then it all hinges on getting that right.
Getting that right, yeah. And the way we currently do it is I mean, we're just trying to get people to use it. So we don't block anyone, and nor do we want to. But we have there's actually two reviews. We try to get generalists, non-experts, to question a claim. And that sends a signal, hey, people are doubtful, people don't know this is true. And the hope is that then it motivates a reviewer, an expert, to come and actually review the claim. And just almost by having those two lanes, we're hoping that naturally happens and people self-select a little bit. But yeah, I mean, we are seeing that, but the current set of users are quite, in good faith. They're good faith actors, right? So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it's an exciting problem. I mean, another intuition that might be worth exploring, and maybe there are just, you know, user experience reasons not to do this, but you could imagine building a system where you actually don't reveal comments until there are a couple of first commenters, and then you reveal them all at once. So you reveal the first three and you randomize their order. Little things like that might help, but there could be user experience reasons why that might be challenging.
Uh, yeah, no, but yeah, if we had enough reviewers where we could achieve that I think that would be a lot better. So just to summarize, in the first paper, these are really deep insights for us, which is thinking about a scale of truth. The probabilistic can really drive a lot of collective learning, much more willingness to change belief, learn from others. You can do that through language, which we're kind of doing. I was glad to hear you say that. But we could also just directly build that in the interface, a sliding scale. And then thinking about the first mover with more intention, I think is going to be really important as we move forward.
Yeah, and just for your viewers, I just want to really quickly note that in some ways the climactic finding of our paper, right, was its relevance to partisanship. So if you actually see in our stimuli that Republicans are more likely to trust some of the content than Democrats, in particularly the right-leaning content. In the binary condition, you basically see no movement, no increasing similarity between Republicans and Democrats. You see the significant polarization at baseline, um, significantly different judgments between these political groups of content, and it stays intact. Whereas in the probabilistic condition, you see that same baseline difference. Okay, so the initial condition is basically the same, but by being able to share their probabilistic judgments, you see the Republicans and the Democrats actually converge and start to much more significantly overlap, so that actually there's no longer any significant differences in their belief distributions and how they're actually responding to the content.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I remember that. I'm gonna just share this graph really quick. So I thought this was fascinating that, when you actually break it down by the topics they were reviewing, the difference between binary, which is the gray circle, and probabilistic, the green triangle, is massive on certain topics, particularly terrorism and news, where you saw a huge change when you let people have gradations.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a lot for us to learn there. And I think that anyone who's working on this problem needs to think about the domain they're in, because it's probably not a one size fits all solution.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth noting that within that study, we didn't really have enough instances of each content to say this applies to terrorism in general or news in general, but it was to show that the effects are sensitive to, I would say probably more likely in this situation, to the actual content itself. So certain articles are going to be more ambiguous, and that itself might vary by content, right? So we observed that both binary and publicity conditions actually improved very reliably on the health topic, but that may have been because the actual articles we had on that topic were actually more ambiguous. So the people, whether you're in a binary or probabilistic condition, you're getting a rather clear signal that you might be having the wrong view, right? Whereas there can be other forms of content that are more difficult to parse. Maybe you're reaching a 50-50 state, And so, and those might be the more partisan ones. And that's where some of these probabilistic benefits are especially useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Douglas, so do you have time to jump into the second study, or
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to.
okay, yeah, let's do that. So do you want to walk us through this experiment and tell us, how you set it up and what your results were?
Yeah, so this one was in the Proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences. And the key question here was, we know how social learning can benefit judgments, but the question is, until that paper, people didn't really have any information about who they were communicating with in these collective intelligence experiments. But the thought was really a sociological question, which was, what if I now know something about the source of the information? Does that change my willingness to use that information and learn from it? And a clear case where that's relevant is in the case of partisanship, where you could have the exact same belief, but if it's coming from someone within your party, that means something very different. It could mean something very different than if that same information is coming from someone outside your party, or the opposing party. And so we picked a partisan topic, climate change. And first, we had them anticipating the uh, amount of Arctic sea ice out in the future, like 5 years out in the future. And what we could see was whether people thought Arctic sea ice was going up or down. And the graph was ambiguous because even though there was a clear statistical trend down, it was a bit noisy, and the most recent data point uh,
Yeah,
was aiming upward. So people could look at the most recent data point and say, okay, it's going up. That means it's going to go up in the future. Or they're going to look at the whole trend overall and say, that's just statistical noise. Overall, it's going down. And we show that their willingness to make that error, their susceptibility to making that error, was a product of partisanship. So our right-wing participants were more likely to make that judgment error, which is consistent with the fact that being on the right is associated with greater rates of climate denial, or denying that it's human caused, and just general skepticism about the climate change narrative. Now, we said, okay, so we know that there's clear differences between right-wing and left-wing participants in their ability to code this graph accurately. So can we get them to exchange judgments and actually learn in their ability to interpret this graph and arrive at the correct judgment? And then the question was, okay, well, we could have them share their numeric judgments looking at the graph, how much sea ice is there going to be in the future? But then what if they now know that they're actually in a mixed political network where they're actually exchanging information with both within party and outside of party individuals? Are they still willing to learn? And in some sense, the broader question was, how does that collective intelligence process unfold when it either is or is not politicized? Right? One is the case where it's not politicized, you're just trying to make sense of this graph. The other one is the case where you're reminded this is a political conversation about climate change, so your political identity is somehow at stake, or plays a key role. And so what we found, um, if you'd like, I don't know if you have the
I,
figures you want to
I do.
pull it
Yeah,
up.
I'll share the third graph in the paper.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we found is panel A, right, is the percent of people who accurately predicted the climate trend. And it's worth noting here, we had a control group, which is people who were not actually socializing at all, just individuals. This is where we could see that there are big differences between right-wing and left-wing individuals on their own. Liberals were much more likely to estimate the correct trend. And we
That's
see,
the difference right here.
yeah, exactly. And what we can see is that difference also, it's in the next figure. We don't have to go to that just yet, but in the next figure, you'll see that that baseline difference uh, between conservatives and liberals also was the case in all of the mixed networks, which is really nice for us, because then you can directly study how communication in the network actually influence that political difference. And what you see, we have a condition where people interacted, where there was a party logo on the screen, which was basically just politicizing the environment, priming them to think that it was a political conversation. We had the case where there was no logo, but what they saw was next to each person in the network that they were talking to, they got to see their political partisanship. So they could see that they were actually in a politically mixed network. And then there was an environment where they didn't see any political cues at all. They were just being told that they were interacting with random folks from the internet trying to make sense of this graph. Now, the instructions were exactly the same across all conditions. The only thing we really turned on and off was whether or not these political
But they
symbols
saw
were
the party logo.
exactly, or
Yeah.
the political identity of who they were talking to. And then what you see on the right graph here is the improvement in their judgments, the fraction of individuals who are improving in their ability to interpret the graph.
And
What you
that's
see in the control condition are minimal improvements. Now, if you go to the networks with party logos, you again see rather minimal improvements, actually no more significant improvements than the control condition. If you go to the network with political identities revealed, you see that there are improvements relative to controls, but again, the effect isn't actually all that strong. There's no major difference between that condition and the party logo condition. But the home run outcome is really in the condition where there was no political signaling at all, just anonymous folks communicating their views. And here we see these drastic improvements in judgment, better than all of the conditions. And this was really where the social learning process really took off. Now, if you can go to the next figure, I want to show that this actually had some particularly surprising implications because this is basically breaking that down by how each group, conservatives and liberals, are uh, behaving in each condition. So in the control condition, you see, liberals are doing better than conservatives in their accuracy, and again, minimal changes. They stay significantly different. The network with party logos, again, we see that they're significantly different, basically no change, minimal change. In the network condition with the political identities, we see that they're significantly different initially. Now we see improvements, but we still see that they're significantly different. So we haven't really removed polarization or even reduced it. But in the network condition with no political cues, you see not only are there significant improvements, but the conservatives do way better. In a sense, the effect was the conservatives were much more likely to make use of the social information when they didn't know that they were interacting with liberals. And so the conservatives are actually doing better than the liberals by the end of the task. Not significantly so, but you can look at the
yeah, yeah.
averages and you see that.
Yeah, I see the delta here. So
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so this is like both hopeful but also kind of, it shows how hard it is to overcome partisanship. Um, so maybe we could shift a little bit to, what are the implications if we realize that even just kind of introducing a party logo can reduce the collective learning that happens in a community. Um, what would you recommend? Like, I mean, what can we do in society, on social networks, in the media, et cetera, to try to improve social learning, and decrease partisanship?
Yeah, so I'll start with the bad news, and then I'll say some good news, which actually relates directly to AverPoint's role in all this. So the bad news is that these public social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, other venues, YouTube, Reddit, so on, they are politicized. They're highly politicized. I mean, that can be seen by the mountain of papers looking at the partisan debate and vitriol that unfold on these platforms and all of the various forms of social bias. It's also the fact that they're full of uh, political images, political advertisements. A good number of users of Twitter, for instance, explicitly signal their partisanship in their banner or in their bio. So it's a highly partisan space. Now, there have been some attempts to study social learning on these platforms, and some studies have arrived at the conclusion that actually being exposed to the opposite opinion actually increases your partisan bias. Now, that very well might be true on these environments like Twitter, but it's not clear that the effect is really the exposure to opposing opinions itself, because actually in collective intelligence, that can facilitate social learning. You actually want people to have different views. And so, uh, without getting too technical, it's called the diversity prediction theorem. But basically, you want there to be a diversity of judgments in the group so that the aggregate is actually more likely to catch the truth, or contain the truth. Um, so when you see these backfire effects or these polarization effects on social media, it may very well be a part of the fact that this is a highly politicized environment. So, the magic wand would be to remove all of the partisan signaling from these platforms, but yeah, right, that'll never happen. These platforms are too entrenched in a particular business model. Like, if especially if you think the American population were told that they're not allowed to communicate their political identity, that very well might be viewed as an infringement of freedom of speech of some kind. So a platform like that, especially with those regulations, those norms already in place, very unlikely to make these large changes. But the good news is I think there's ample room for mediary platforms like AverPoint, fact-checking organizations, where you have the ability to design a platform that actually prevents all of this explicit political signaling when people are sharing and aggregating their judgments. So there's an opportunity to create, in some ways, the ideal conditions for collective intelligence that will be unbiased or less likely to be biased by political identities. And just to say that, I mean, there is precedence for this in the quote unquote real world, which I just mean offline, where there's several states where in voting booths they're actually not allowed to use political branding. They're not allowed to have any colors associated with political parties, any political party logos or descriptions, because they, rightly so, are concerned about that priming people's views. If you go to a quote unquote neutral voting booth, but it's just decked out in Republican imagery, you could imagine how that might have even a small push, a nudge to people to be more likely to vote for the right wing. But at the order of millions, increasing it by one percent or one half of a percent can actually matter, as we know in the most recent election, right? Like these small differences matter. And so they have a law against not doing that. And so it makes sense if you're trying to create an online environment that is in some ways protected against unnecessary political biases, you can design a platform that tries to limit political identity signaling.
Yeah, and then if you have a minute, there's like another take on this, which is that like in some sense, a cynic might read your paper and say, "Oh, this is a handbook. Like all I have to do is show a logo, and I can like stop people from learning all the bad things I'm doing. And if I get their tribal affiliation, I can just show them my logo and get away with whatever I want to get away with, right? Like, I don't know if you're a Simpsons fan, but there's
Yeah, I'm of the generation, of course.
yeah, it's like Lisa shows Mr. Burns like why you should cut your six-pack rings because they can catch fish, and he looks at it and then he like makes a whole like a machine net like industrial fishing apparatus. So like
Right, right.
long story. I mean, I think one thing is like partisanship is so easy to trigger and it's so powerful at blocking learning, or at least winning loyalty. Um, we've thought about AverPoint in some ways is what if we try to think of it as a new tribe, a new partisanship, which is a partisanship that believes that your ideas should be verifiable with facts and sources. You're open to questions and criticism. And like that is itself an identity that you can signal to people that competes with a more kind of blind loyalty to a party, that blocks questioning and learning. Like the act of questioning and learning is itself a part, is like a different, on a different axis, a tribal affiliation.
Yeah, I mean, the question of how to grow a culture of that kind is fascinating and really non-trivial. So I mean, that's a whole other area of study. I'd be happy to talk more another time about it. But it's basically, it is interesting in general to think about how do you actually foster a culture that, as a norm, has a what you could and act more philosophically call an epistemic norm, or just a culture around evaluating each other's claims. How do you foster that? And building a group identity predicated on that basis could help. I mean, arguably, academia, if you're thinking of it as in the ideal, is supposed to be that. It's supposed to be and most of the time it actually does a pretty good job. But there are ways of developing organizations where being a member of that, what you're signing up for is to learn and participate in a culture focused on content verifiability and you know, like as you said, helping credible content in, right? Um, but there are all kinds of ways in which building a culture in terms of a social engineering type framework can backfire. And so, because it's really hard, some of these things you just kind of hope that they grow endogenously, which is to say, like groups figure it out on their own and build something that's well suited to their dispositions. But that's not always possible. But some platforms like Reddit Science Thread or other threads on Reddit have succeeded in being like really rich, critical spaces for dialogue. And there is some way in which people identify as Redditors, right? And so I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a partisanship, right? But it's a kind of informal affiliation where, yeah, they take pride in being a Redditor and contributing to these threads. And I think that there could be great value for AverPoint doing that, fostering some sort of a sense of pride and sense of purpose, people finding meaning. And a part of that will be having a culture where people congratulate each other and encourage each other and work together as a team so people feel safe. I would say one of the potential challenges to that, which can be overcome, but something to be wary of, I would say, is that if in, 'cause sometimes these communities that are concerned with evaluating content and being truthful, they can fall into the pattern of kind of only like all too quickly accusing someone else of either being wrong or stupid. Um, because they're in the mode of critique, right?
Right,
And so
right.
they want to draw a hard boundary. Part of the probabilistic thinking, the more I guess a nuance oriented thinking, is to say that they're actually like it's actually a rather rare scenario where someone is just completely wrong. Like it's really hard to be completely wrong about something, which is to say that there are probably some components, even if most of what they say is bogus, there's probably something that could provide common ground, like the very fact that someone recognizes they're in a country called the United States. Like there's this basis of common ground where they might not disagree with.
Right.
And so, how do you open the space for building that common ground? And a part of it could be fostering a kind of what's called in the management literature psychological safety, which is to say a space where people actually feel comfortable sharing their views, even if it's unpopular. And so, if you can build a culture where people can do that and not be too concerned about being kicked out of the group or being overly criticized, then you can actually foster a really rich space of dialogue. Now, the challenge is how do you create that safe space for openness while also uh, cultivating a really strong shared norm around what counts as good evidence, what counts as a quality argument, and honestly, figuring that out would be an invaluable service, and growing a platform where that is demonstrated and maintained would be a really excellent contribution.
Well, we hope to keep talking to you and keep learning as we embark on that. So congrats again on the paper. I think it's going to affect a lot of people working on this. It's quite a finding. So congrats again on that, and thank you for all the time today. And we hope to keep this conversation going.
Yes, thank you for all your great work on promoting credible content and the healthy information ecosystem. Really appreciate it, and really thanks so much for your attention. I look forward to being in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Douglas.